You begin noticing something unusual inside your mind. The old emotional reactions no longer feel automatic. There is a silent gap between trigger and response. In that gap, something new is awakening awareness. This is the first sign your shadow is no longer leading you. There comes a moment in your inner world when something subtle shifts, so quiet that at first you almost miss it. Life looks the same, people behave the same, situations unfold in familiar patterns, yet something inside you is no longer reacting the way it used to. You feel it in small pauses, in the space between what happens and what you used to feel. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. But it is undeniable. And for the first time, you begin to sense a strange distance between you and your own emotions. You are still you, but not fully the old version anymore. It is as if a silent observer inside your mind has begun waking up. You notice that a comment which once would have triggered anger, now passes through you with less force. A memory that once pulled you into sadness, now feels like something you are watching rather than reliving. Even your fears, those deep familiar ones, do not arrive with the same authority they once had. And in that small shift, your shadow begins to lose its grip. But to understand this moment, you must first understand what has been controlling you. For most of your life, your reactions were never truly conscious decisions. They were conditioned responses, written into your subconscious through repetition, emotion, and experience. Every time you reacted without thinking, every time fear decided faster than awareness, every time doubt spoke louder than truth, a deeper program was being reinforced. And you never questioned it. Because it felt like you. But now something is different. Now there is a gap. A space between trigger and response. And in that space, awareness is born. At first, this gap feels uncomfortable. Your mind tries to close it quickly. It wants the old automatic reactions back because they are familiar. It wants certainty, even if that certainty is pain. But you are no longer fully available to those old commands. You pause now. Even for a second. And that second changes everything. Because in that pause, you begin to see the machinery of your mind. You start noticing how thoughts rise before emotions. How emotions try to dictate action. How memory attempts to rewrite the present moment. It is all happening fast, but you are no longer completely inside it. You are watching it unfold. And this is where the inner struggle begins. Because the old version of you was built on reaction. If someone ignored you, you felt rejection instantly. If something failed, you felt defeat instantly. If uncertainty appeared, fear filled the space instantly. There was no gap. No pause. Just immediate emotional identity. But now, there is resistance inside that system. A part of you still wants to react. Still wants to fall into old emotional loops. Still wants to believe every thought it produces. But another part of you, a quieter, deeper part, refuses to fully participate anymore. And this creates tension. You feel like you are between two versions of yourself. One that reacts, and one that observes. One that panics, and one that watches calmly. This is not confusion. This is awakening. Because what you are experiencing is the separation between consciousness and conditioning. And slowly, you begin to realize something powerful. Your shadow was never an enemy. It was an unobserved program running in the background of your mind. It controlled your energy not because it was stronger than you, but because you were unconscious of it. But now awareness is entering the system. And awareness changes everything. Because what is seen clearly can no longer operate in darkness. You begin to notice patterns that were invisible before. The same emotional cycles repeating in different situations. The same fear wearing different masks. The same doubt appearing in new forms. It is all connected. It is all mechanical. It is all predictable. And once something becomes predictable, it loses authority over you. Now you start to reprogram, not by force, but by observation. Instead of fighting thoughts, you begin to watch them rise and fall. Instead of resisting emotions, you allow them to pass through without identity attachment. Instead of believing every inner voice, you begin asking silently, is this truth, or is this old coding? And this question alone begins to break the loop. Because the subconscious mind responds to attention. What you repeatedly observe without emotional reaction begins to weaken its influence. And what you repeatedly choose with awareness begins to strengthen its presence. So slowly, you introduce new inner instructions. When fear appears, you do not merge with it, you label it as old data. When doubt speaks, you do not obey it, you recognize it as recycled memory. When uncertainty rises, you do not collapse, you breathe into the gap between thought and reaction. And in that gap, something new is forming. A calmness that does not depend on circumstances. A clarity that does not need validation. A presence that does not break under emotional pressure. You are not becoming someone else. You are returning to the part of you that was never controlled. And the more you stay in this awareness, the more your identity begins to shift. You are no longer the person who reacts first and understands later. You are becoming the one who sees first and chooses next. And this changes everything about your inner world. Because when identity shifts, perception shifts. And when perception shifts, reality begins to reorganize itself around your new awareness. Now, even in daily life, you start practicing this silently. When something triggers you, you do not rush to respond. You pause and notice the energy. You feel it without becoming it. You observe the story forming in your mind, and you let it dissolve before it controls your actions. This is not suppression. This is mastery. And slowly, you realize something even deeper. Your energy was never truly controlled by the outside world. It was controlled by how quickly you forgot yourself in reaction. But now you are remembering. Remembering the space before reaction. Remembering the silence behind thought. Remembering the awareness that existed before conditioning. And in that remembrance, the shadow begins to lose its voice completely. Not because it disappeared, but because it is no longer in charge. And as you continue walking in this awareness, you begin to sense that this is only the beginning of something deeper unfolding within you. A shift that is not yet complete, but already irreversible. Your thoughts once felt like commands, absolute and final. Now they begin to feel like passing signals in a larger field. You are no longer inside every thought, you are watching them. This distance creates the beginning of mental freedom. Reality starts to loosen its grip on your identity. There is a very quiet turning point in human awareness that most people never recognize while it is happening. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with drama or emotional shock. Instead, it comes like a soft internal shift, where something you once believed without question begins to feel slightly less absolute. Your thoughts. For most of your life, they were not just thoughts. They were instructions. Commands. Truths. When a thought appeared, you obeyed it instantly without negotiation. If it said you are not enough, you felt it as identity. If it said this will fail, you accepted it as prediction. If it said you should be afraid, your entire system reacted as if danger was already real. There was no space between you and the thought. No distance. No awareness of separation. But now, something unusual begins to happen. You still hear thoughts. But you no longer merge with all of them. And this change feels strange at first. Because part of your mind still tries to treat every thought as reality, but another part is beginning to question the urgency behind them. You start noticing something subtle. A thought appears, and instead of becoming it immediately, you observe it first. And in that observation, something breaks. Not the mind, but the automatic control it once had over you. At first, this creates inner confusion. Because the old system inside you was built on instant belief. There was no pause, no filter, no separation. Thought and identity were one continuous flow. If the mind said something, the body followed. If emotion arose, action followed. Everything was immediate, reactive, automatic. But now there is interruption. A gap. A silence between thought and reaction. And in that silence, awareness begins to breathe. You start feeling like you are standing slightly behind your thoughts instead of inside them. It is as if you are no longer sitting in the center of your mind, but watching it from a quiet distance. And this distance changes everything. Because what you are beginning to realize is simple, but profound. You are not the stream of thoughts. You are the awareness observing the stream. But the inner struggle still appears. Because thoughts do not stop. They continue to come. Fear-based thoughts still rise. Doubt still speaks. Old memories still replay. Future worries still attempt to build emotional pressure. But something in you refuses to treat them all as commands now. Instead, you begin to recognize them as signals. Not truths. Not identities. Just signals moving through a mental field. And this shift creates resistance inside the old version of you. That version of you relied on believing thoughts instantly. It needed certainty. It needed emotional reaction. It needed identity attachment. Without that, it feels unstable. But you are no longer feeding that pattern in the same way. And so the mind tries harder at first. It repeats thoughts louder. It increases emotional intensity. It tries to pull you back into automatic belief. But something deeper in you is learning a new response. You pause. You observe. You breathe. And you let the thought exist without becoming it. And in that moment, the thought loses its authority. Not because it disappeared, but because it was no longer obeyed. This is the beginning of mental freedom. And slowly, you begin to see how your inner world was functioning all along. Your subconscious mind was not trying to harm you. It was simply repeating patterns that were never questioned. Thoughts that were repeated became beliefs. Beliefs became emotional responses. Emotional responses became identity. And identity became your version of reality. But now you are interrupting that chain. You are inserting awareness between thought and belief. And that changes the entire structure. Because now, a thought can appear without automatically becoming a belief. And a belief can be questioned without immediately defining your identity. An identity can soften without collapsing your sense of self. You begin to notice something powerful. When you stop immediately believing every thought, the emotional weight of those thoughts begins to dissolve. A thought like "I am not enough" no longer creates instant emotional collapse. Instead, you see it, and something inside you quietly responds, "This is an old pattern, not a current truth." And in that recognition, the thought weakens. Not through resistance, but through awareness. Now your inner experience starts to feel different. There is more space in your mind. More silence between mental events. More room to choose your response. This space is not empty. It is alive with consciousness. And in this space, something new begins to form. A version of you that is no longer driven by automatic mental reactions. You are becoming the one who sees thoughts before they become identity. And this changes your entire emotional landscape. Situations still happen. Life still moves. Challenges still appear. But the internal interpretation of those events is no longer immediate and unconscious. There is a pause now. A moment where you are no longer trapped inside meaning-making. And in that moment, you regain control. Not control over life, but control over interpretation. And interpretation is where suffering is created or dissolved. Now, you begin practicing this awareness in small daily moments. When a thought arises, you do not argue with it. You do not suppress it. You do not chase it. You simply notice it as movement in the mind. You might silently say to yourself, "This is a thought, not a command." And that simple recognition creates a shift in your entire nervous system. Because the body no longer reacts to every mental signal as if it is real danger or absolute truth. You are training yourself to remain the observer. And the more you remain the observer, the less power unconscious thoughts have over your emotional state. Slowly, your mind begins to reorganize itself around this new pattern. Thoughts still come, but they no longer define you instantly. Emotion still arises, but it no longer dictates identity. And reality itself begins to feel less rigid, less fixed, less absolute. Because what you once called reality was largely shaped by unquestioned thinking. Now that thinking is being seen. And what is seen clearly begins to lose its control. You are not trying to silence your mind. You are learning to no longer be controlled by it. And in that learning, something profound begins to unfold. A deeper layer of awareness opens inside you, where thoughts are no longer instructions, but passing waves in a much larger field of consciousness. And you begin to wonder quietly what exists beneath even this layer of observation. You discover that your reactions were never truly yours. They were programmed responses stored deep in emotional memory. Old fear patterns still attempt to control your present self. But now you can see the code running beneath the surface. And what is seen begins to lose its power. There is a moment in inner awareness where everything you believed about yourself begins to feel mechanical. Not meaningless, but mechanical. As if behind your emotions, behind your reactions, behind your sudden shifts in mood and behavior, there is something quietly operating in the background. A system. A code. A pattern repeating itself in silence. And once you begin to notice this, you can never fully return to unconscious living in the same way again. Because you start to see something uncomfortable, yet liberating. Your reactions were never completely yours. They were learned. Stored. Replayed. Activated by triggers that you never consciously chose. For most of your life, a situation would happen, and something inside you would respond instantly. A tone of voice would trigger anger. A memory would trigger sadness. Uncertainty would trigger fear. Rejection would trigger collapse. And you called it personality. But now you are beginning to see deeper. Now you are beginning to see the structure beneath the reaction. And it changes everything. At first, this awareness feels subtle. Almost invisible. You do not suddenly become free. Instead, you start noticing patterns you never questioned before. The same emotional reactions appearing in different situations. The same inner fear wearing different faces. The same doubt repeating its voice in slightly different words. And something inside you begins to whisper. This is not random, this is repetition. But even then, the old system still tries to pull you back. Because there is comfort in automatic reaction. Even painful reactions feel familiar. Even fear feels predictable. And the subconscious mind prefers what is familiar over what is unknown. So when life triggers you, your old programming still tries to activate instantly. But now, there is something new present. Awareness. And awareness creates interference in the automatic loop. You feel it before the reaction completes. Attention. A pause. A strange sense of distance. As if the reaction is happening, but you are not fully inside it anymore. And in that distance, you begin to see the code. Not literally, but psychologically. You start noticing how every emotional reaction follows a sequence. Trigger, thought, emotion, identity, reaction. And you realize you have been living inside this sequence your entire life without ever stepping outside of it. But now you are no longer fully inside it. Now you are observing it unfold. And this observation begins to weaken its control. Because what is observed clearly cannot operate in full unconscious power anymore. This is the beginning of psychological freedom. But the mind does not give up easily. Old fear patterns still attempt to activate. They rise from memory like echoes stored deep in emotional experience. A past rejection still tries to define a present interaction. An old failure still tries to shape a new decision. A childhood fear still whispers through adult situations. But now something has changed. You are no longer merging with those echoes instantly. Instead, you recognize them. Not as truth, but as stored emotional data. And this recognition is the turning point. Because the moment you see a reaction as programmed memory, you begin to separate from it. And separation creates space. And space creates choice. And choice creates freedom. You begin to realize something profound. Your mind is not attacking you. It is repeating what was never rewritten. It is running old emotional scripts based on past experiences that were never fully processed. And those scripts are what you once called instinct, personality, or who I am. But now you see them differently. Now you see them as patterns. And patterns can be changed. So you begin the quiet process of reprogramming, not by force, but by awareness. Instead of reacting instantly, you pause. Instead of identifying with emotion, you observe it. Instead of believing the first thought, you question its origin. And in this questioning, something begins to dissolve. The intensity of old reactions weakens. Not because you are fighting them, but because you are no longer feeding them unconscious belief. And the subconscious mind responds to attention more than force. What you observe without identification begins to lose its authority over you. Now, when fear rises, you do not collapse into it. You recognize it as old survival code. When anger rises, you do not become it immediately. You see it as emotional defense programming. When doubt rises, you do not accept it as identity. You recognize it as repetition of past limitation. And slowly, your internal system begins to reorganize itself. You are not deleting your past. You are rewriting your relationship to it. And this changes your entire emotional structure. Because once a reaction is no longer automatic, it becomes conscious. And once it becomes conscious, it becomes editable. Now you begin to experience something new in your daily life. Situations that once controlled your mood no longer have the same power. Words that once triggered emotional collapse now pass through with less weight. Memories that once pulled you backward now feel like distant information instead of present identity. You are still feeling. But you are no longer being controlled by feeling. And in this shift, a deeper identity begins to form. A version of you that is no longer reactive by default, but aware before response. And this awareness becomes your new center. You start to realize something even deeper. If reactions were programmed, then they were installed through repetition, emotion, and belief. Which means they can also be uninstalled through awareness, observation, and new repetition. So you begin practicing a new internal language. When a reaction rises, you silently acknowledge. This is old programming, not present truth. And that simple recognition creates space between stimulus and response. In that space, you are free. Free to choose a new interpretation. Free to pause instead of react. Free to respond from awareness instead of memory. And slowly, this becomes your new internal habit. Not perfection, but presence. Not control through force, but control through clarity. And as you continue this process, you begin to notice something subtle but powerful. Your shadow, the unconscious part of you that once controlled your reactions, is no longer invisible. It is visible now. And what is visible begins to lose its dominance. Because darkness only controls what remains unseen. And now you are seeing. Seeing the patterns. Seeing the code. Seeing the repetition. And in that seeing, something inside you begins to soften. Not because the shadow disappeared, but because it has been brought into awareness. And awareness is the beginning of transformation that cannot be reversed. Emotions rise, but they no longer pull you under. You feel the storm, yet remain untouched at the center. This is not suppression, it is conscious witnessing. The mind begins to separate from emotional identity. Control is no longer force, it is awareness. There is a very quiet moment in inner evolution where something once overwhelming begins to feel distant. Not gone. Not suppressed. But distant. You still feel emotions rising inside you. You still sense pressure in the chest when something triggers you. You still notice the wave of irritation, fear, sadness, or uncertainty forming within your system. But something fundamental has changed in how you experience it. You are no longer inside the storm. You are aware of it. And that awareness creates a separation that cannot be reversed once it is seen. At first, this feels unfamiliar. Because for most of your life, emotion was identity. If you felt anger, you became anger. If you felt fear, you became fear. If sadness appeared, your entire inner world collapsed into it. There was no space between feeling and self. Emotion was not something you had. It was something you were. But now, something different is happening. A pause. A gap. A quiet witnessing presence that does not disappear when emotion appears. And this changes everything. Because now, when emotions rise, they no longer automatically define who you are. You begin to notice the feeling instead of becoming the feeling. And in that noticing, the structure of emotional control begins to break. But the old system inside you does not give up easily. It has been trained through repetition. For years, every emotional trigger created immediate identity. Every emotional surge demanded instant reaction. Every internal wave pulled you into unconscious behavior. So even now, when something painful happens, the old pattern still tries to activate. A situation arises, an emotion rises with it. And the mind whispers instantly. Become this, react this, become this, react this. But something in you interrupts the loop. Not forcefully. Not aggressively. But silently. You watch. And in that watching, the loop fails to complete itself in the same way. This is where the inner struggle begins. Because part of you still wants to dive into emotion. Still wants to react instantly. Still wants to believe the intensity is truth. Emotional energy feels convincing. It feels real. It feels urgent. But another part of you is no longer fully inside it. That part is observing. And this creates tension between reaction and awareness. Between old identity and emerging consciousness. But slowly, awareness begins to take precedence. And you start realizing something profound. Emotions are not commands. They are energy patterns moving through consciousness. And energy can be witnessed without identification. At first, this feels impossible. How can you feel anger and not become angry? How can you feel fear and not become afraid? But then you begin to experience it directly. You feel the wave of emotion, but there is something steady underneath it. A stillness that does not react. A center that does not collapse. And you realize. You are not the wave. You are the space in which the wave appears. This recognition is subtle, but powerful. Because the moment you identify with the space instead of the wave, emotional control shifts from reaction to awareness. Now the storm still appears in your inner world. But it does not pull you under in the same way. You feel it, but you are not consumed by it. And this is not emotional numbness. This is emotional clarity. The difference is profound. Suppression hides emotion. Awareness sees emotion. And what is seen clearly begins to lose unconscious control over you. Now your inner struggle begins to soften. Because emotions no longer have the same authority they once had. They still arise. But they no longer define your entire state of being. And this changes your identity slowly, silently, deeply. You are no longer the reactive self. You are becoming the observing self. And this shift feels like stepping out of a storm you once thought was your entire world. But now you see, it was only weather inside the mind. Not identity. Not truth. Just movement. And once you see it this way, everything begins to reorganize internally. You notice that emotional intensity still exists, but your attachment to it is weakening. And in that weakening, space is created. Space to respond instead of react. Space to observe instead of merge. Space to choose instead of obey. And this space is where transformation lives. Now you begin reprogramming not by stopping emotions, but by changing your relationship to them. When anger arises, you silently recognize, this is energy moving through the system. When fear arises, you notice, this is old survival coding activating. When sadness rises, you observe, this is memory expressing itself. And in each recognition, something important happens. The emotion is no longer amplified by unconscious identity. It simply passes through. Like weather. Like energy. Like data moving through a system that is now being observed. And because you are no longer resisting it, it moves faster. Because resistance was never control. It was amplification. Now, without resistance, emotional waves begin to lose their grip more quickly. Not because they are weaker, but because you are no longer merging with them. And this creates a new internal baseline. A calm presence that remains even when emotional movement occurs. You begin to notice this in daily life. Situations that once pulled you into emotional extremes now feel manageable. Conversations that once triggered internal chaos now feel lighter. Memories that once controlled your mood now feel distant. Not erased, but observed. And this observation is the key. Because observation creates separation. And separation creates freedom. And freedom creates conscious choice. Now, in moments of emotional intensity, you begin practicing something simple but powerful. You do not fight the emotion. You do not escape it. You do not become it. You simply stay aware of it. You breathe into the space behind it. And you remind yourself internally. I am the awareness experiencing this, not the emotion itself. And slowly, this becomes your new inner reflex. Not emotional reaction, but conscious witnessing. And in this witnessing, identity begins to shift again. Because if you are not the emotion, and you are not the thought, then what are you? And the answer does not come from thinking. It comes from awareness itself. A silent, steady presence that remains unchanged even when everything inside you moves. And as you begin living from this presence more often, emotional chaos starts losing its authority over your energy completely. Not because emotions disappear, but because you no longer belong to them. And this realization settles deeper and deeper into your inner world. Until even the storm begins to feel like something you can observe without fear. The identity you once defended begins to dissolve. Old labels, fears, and definitions lose their meaning. You are not becoming someone new, you are unlearning the old. A quiet emptiness appears, but it feels like space, not loss. In this space, reprogramming becomes possible. There is a point in inner transformation where something unexpected begins to happen, not because you are trying to change, but because the structure that once defined you starts to loosen on its own. It does not collapse loudly. It dissolves quietly. And at first, you don't even recognize it as change. You only notice that the things you once held tightly inside your identity no longer feel as solid as they used to. The labels. The fears. The roles you played in your own mind. The definitions you repeated about who you are and what you are not. All of it begins to feel less real. Not because life has changed, but because your attachment to those definitions is weakening. And this creates a strange internal experience. A silence that feels unfamiliar. Because for most of your life, you were built around identity structures that gave you a sense of stability. You knew who you were based on your reactions, your memories, your achievements, your failures, your emotional patterns. Even your fears became part of your identity story. But now something is shifting beneath that story. And you begin to sense it before you can explain it. A quiet space forming inside you where old definitions used to live. At first, the mind resists this. Because identity does not dissolve without resistance. It tries to hold on. It brings back old thoughts, old fears, old interpretations. It whispers, "Don't lose this, this is who you are." But something deeper in you is no longer fully convinced. Because you are beginning to see something that was hidden before. You are not your identity. You are the awareness experiencing it. And once this recognition begins, everything you once considered self starts to feel less fixed. The inner struggle becomes subtle but noticeable. Because part of you still tries to defend old patterns. It tries to maintain emotional familiarity. It tries to keep the same reactions, the same beliefs, the same internal definitions. But another part of you is no longer fully participating in that defense. It is watching, observing, stepping slightly outside the structure. And this creates a gap. A gap between who you thought you were and what you are experiencing now. In that gap, identity begins to soften. You may notice it in simple moments. A reaction that once felt automatic now feels delayed. A belief that once felt absolute now feels questionable. A fear that once defined your limits now feels like an old recording playing in the background of your mind. And you begin to realize something profound. Identity is not fixed. It is maintained by repetition. And repetition is now weakening. Because awareness is interrupting it. Now, instead of automatically saying this is who I am, you begin to notice. This is a pattern I have been repeating. And in that recognition, identity loses its grip. But what replaces it is not confusion. It is space. A quiet, open space inside your mind that feels unfamiliar but not threatening. At first, this emptiness can feel uncomfortable. Because the mind is trained to associate emptiness with loss. But this is not loss. This is clearing. This is the removal of internal noise that once defined your psychological structure. And in this clearing, something new becomes possible. Reprogramming. But not the kind of reprogramming that forces change. The kind that happens naturally when old patterns are no longer fully supported by belief. You begin to notice that you can observe your thoughts without attaching identity to them. You can feel emotions without labeling them as personality. You can experience fear without calling it who I am. And this separation changes everything. Because once identity is no longer fused with experience, experience becomes fluid. And fluidity creates freedom. Now you start to realize something even deeper. The identity you once defended so strongly was never a permanent truth. It was a constructed pattern built from memory, repetition, environment, and emotional conditioning. And anything constructed can be deconstructed. Not by force, but by awareness. So you begin the quiet process of unlearning. You stop reinforcing old definitions unconsciously. You stop repeating limiting labels internally. You stop attaching identity to every emotional wave that passes through you. And in doing so, something begins to dissolve. The old you does not disappear violently. It fades. Like a role in a story that no longer needs to be played. And what remains is not emptiness in the negative sense. It is openness. A receptive space where new mental patterns can form without resistance. Now, your inner world begins to feel different. There is less urgency to define everything. Less pressure to react from identity. Less need to prove internal narratives. Instead, there is observation. There is awareness. There is presence. And in this presence, transformation becomes natural rather than forced. You begin to notice how thoughts arise without demanding identity. How emotions appear without requiring ownership. How experiences pass through without leaving permanent psychological marks unless you choose to hold them. And this is where real internal control begins. Not control through suppression, but control through non-identification. Now, you are no longer trying to become someone new. You are allowing the old structure to fall away. And in that falling away, something deeper is revealed. A more stable awareness beneath identity. A silent center that does not shift even when everything else does. And the more you rest in that center, the less important old definitions become. You are not your past. You are not your reactions. You are not your labels. You are the awareness that witnessed all of them forming and dissolving. And in this recognition, something inside you relaxes. The need to maintain identity weakens. The need to defend emotional patterns fades. The need to hold on to fixed self-definitions dissolves. And what replaces it is clarity. A calm clarity that does not depend on identity to feel stable. Now, even in daily life, you begin practicing this silently. When an old thought arises, you do not claim it. You observe it. When an old emotion appears, you do not attach identity to it. You allow it to pass. When an old label tries to define you, you simply notice it as memory activity, not present truth. And in this noticing, something powerful happens. The old identity loses its authority. Not because you fought it, but because you stopped feeding it unconscious belief. And slowly, a new internal experience emerges. Not a new identity built on concepts, but a lived awareness that does not need identity to function. You begin to experience life from this space more often. And from this space, everything feels lighter. Less rigid. Less defined. More open. And as this openness deepens, you begin to sense that you are standing at the edge of something even deeper than identity itself, something that has always been present, but never fully noticed until now. You shift deeper into the witness consciousness. Thoughts, emotions, and memories move like distant waves. You are no longer inside the story, you are watching it unfold. This observer state becomes your inner control center. From here, nothing can secretly control you again. There is a moment in inner awakening where something subtle but irreversible begins to happen inside you. Not a transformation of circumstances. Not a change in the external world. But a shift in where you are positioned inside your own mind. You begin to notice that thoughts are still arising, emotions are still moving, memories are still appearing like fragments of an ongoing inner movie. But something essential has changed. You are no longer fully inside them. You are watching them. And at first, the shift feels almost invisible, like a slight change in distance that you cannot easily describe. Yet you feel it. A quiet separation. A soft inner stepping back. As if the center of your awareness is no longer trapped in every mental event, but resting slightly behind it. And this is the beginning of the observer state. But the mind does not immediately accept this position. Because for years, it has operated from immersion. When a thought appeared, you became it. When emotion rose, you became it. When memory activated, you relived it. There was no gap, no distance, no witnessing presence. Everything was immediate identification. And that identification created the illusion of control, when in reality, it was automatic reaction. But now, something interrupts that pattern. You notice the thought before becoming it. You feel the emotion without fully merging with it. You observe the memory without stepping inside it completely. And this creates a strange internal experience. As if life is still happening within you, but you are no longer lost inside it. At first, this creates confusion. Because part of your mind still wants to engage, react, attach, interpret, and become. It has been trained to do so for years. It believes that involvement is survival. That identification is safety. That reaction is control. But another part of you is beginning to see differently. And that part is quieter. Still. Unmoving. It simply watches. And in that watching, something profound begins to unfold. You begin to realize that thoughts are not commands. They are events. You begin to realize that emotions are not identity. They are waves. You begin to realize that memories are not truth in the present moment. They are echoes. And all of these movements are passing through a field of awareness that does not change when they appear. This is where the inner struggle arises. Because the old system still tries to pull you in. A fear-based thought appears and says, react immediately. A doubt appears and says, this defines you. A memory appears and says, you are still that moment. But now, you are not fully obeying. You are watching. And that watching changes the entire structure of experience. Because what you watch without identification begins to lose its emotional authority over you. Not instantly, but gradually. Like a signal losing strength the further you move from its source. And this is where awareness begins to deepen into witness consciousness. You are no longer just aware of thoughts. You are aware of awareness itself observing thoughts. And this creates a profound internal stillness. Not emptiness, but presence without disturbance. Now, life inside you continues to move. But it no longer defines your center. It moves around awareness, not through identity. And this shift is subtle but life-altering. Because when you are inside the story, every event feels like reality itself. But when you are outside the story, watching it unfold, everything becomes movement within consciousness. And you realize something powerful. You are not the character reacting inside the story. You are the awareness in which the entire story appears. But even this realization is not just intellectual. It begins to reshape your internal reactions. Now, when a thought appears, you do not rush into it. When an emotion rises, you do not collapse into it. When a memory surfaces, you do not relive it automatically. Instead, you observe it like movement passing through a screen of awareness. And in this observation, something begins to settle inside you. The constant urgency to react starts to dissolve. The need to interpret everything immediately begins to soften. The compulsive identification with mental activity weakens. And in its place, stillness grows. This stillness is not passive. It is alert. It is alive. It is aware without being disturbed. And from this stillness, a new kind of control emerges. Not control over life, but control over inner positioning. You can now choose not to enter every thought. You can now choose not to become every emotion. You can now choose not to follow every memory stream. And this choice creates freedom at a level you have never experienced before. Because previously, you believed you were inside your mind. Now you realize, you are the space in which the mind moves. And as this recognition deepens, your daily experience begins to shift. Situations still happen. But your internal reaction becomes slower, more conscious, less automatic. Emotions still arise. But they do not fully define your state. Thoughts still appear. But they do not demand full belief. And slowly, your nervous system begins to adjust to this new mode of being. A calmer mode. A more aware mode. A more centered mode. Now, you begin practicing this observer state intentionally. When you wake up, you do not immediately enter mental narrative. You notice the space before thought. When emotions rise during the day, you pause and watch them like weather passing through awareness. When memories appear, you do not step into them fully. You observe them as passing images within consciousness. And in each moment of observation, something reinforces itself inside you. You are not inside the mind. You are the one observing the mind. And the more you remain in this position, the less power unconscious patterns have over your energy. Because unconscious control only exists when there is no awareness of it. But now, awareness is present. And what is seen clearly can no longer dominate silently. So your inner world begins to reorganize around this new center. The observer state becomes your reference point. Not reaction. Not emotion. Not thought. But awareness itself. And from here, something profound becomes obvious. Nothing inside you can control you without your participation anymore. No thought can fully define you unless you enter it. No emotion can fully consume you unless you identify with it. No memory can fully trap you unless you relive it. And in this understanding, inner freedom becomes stable. Not as a moment, but as a state. And as you continue resting in this observer consciousness, you begin to sense that even this awareness you are experiencing now has a deeper source beneath it, something still more silent, still more fundamental, waiting just beyond the edge of perception. You begin to notice the internal language shaping your reality. Words, images, and feelings form hidden instructions. Now you consciously begin to rewrite those inner scripts. Fear-based coding is replaced with clarity and direction. Your subconscious starts learning a new operating system. There is a moment in inner awareness where you begin to realize something that was always present, but never noticed clearly. You were not only thinking. You were communicating with your subconscious mind. Every thought carried a message. Every inner sentence carried direction. Every repeated feeling became instruction. And slowly, silently, without resistance, your mind began to accept that language as truth. But you never saw it as language. You saw it as reality. Now something is shifting. Now you begin to notice that your inner world is constantly speaking in symbols, images, and emotional signals. Not randomly. Not chaotically. But systematically. As if your mind is running a continuous program in the background. And you are finally seeing the code. At first, this realization feels subtle. Almost like a quiet observation in the background of daily life. You notice how certain words you say to yourself create certain emotional states. You notice how certain mental images immediately change your mood. You notice how certain repeated thoughts quietly shape your expectations before anything even happens. And something inside you begins to awaken. Because if your inner language is shaping your emotional reality, then your reality is not random. It is programmed. And what is programmed can be rewritten. But the mind does not easily accept this truth at first. Because for years, your internal language has been running automatically. Fear-based thoughts appeared and you believed them. Doubt-based sentences formed and you accepted them. Limiting beliefs repeated themselves and you never questioned their origin. They felt like you. But now, you are beginning to see them as patterns. And patterns are not identity. Patterns are repetition. This creates an inner tension. Because part of your mind still speaks in the old language. The language of limitation. The language of fear. The language of survival. It says things like, "You cannot change this. This is just how you are. This will always repeat." But another part of you is no longer accepting every sentence as truth. That part is observing. And in that observation, distance is created. And in that distance, rewriting becomes possible. Now you begin to see your subconscious mind differently. Not as something separate from you, but as a system responding to repeated input. A system that does not judge. A system that simply learns what is repeated with emotional intensity. And this is where the awareness shift deepens. Because if your mind learns through repetition, then every internal message you repeat becomes a command. Every thought repeated becomes architecture. Every emotional statement becomes programming. And suddenly, you realize something powerful. You have been programming yourself all along. But unconsciously. Now that changes. Now you begin to take responsibility for the language inside you. Not in a forceful way, but in a conscious way. You start noticing the words you use internally. You start noticing the images your mind creates when you think about yourself. You start noticing the emotional tone behind your self-talk. And you realize that your subconscious is always listening. Always absorbing. Always learning. So now, you begin to rewrite. Not by fighting the old language, but by introducing a new one. A clearer one. A calmer one. A more aligned one. At first, this feels small. Almost too subtle to matter. But you continue anyway. When an old fear-based thought appears, you do not argue with it. You simply replace it with awareness. This is old coding, not current direction. When doubt appears, you do not fight it. You simply observe it. This is learned limitation, not truth. When emotional instability rises, you do not identify with it. You simply witness it. This is passing programming, not identity. And in each moment of conscious labeling, something begins to shift inside you. Because the subconscious mind responds not only to repetition, but to clarity. And now your internal signals are becoming clearer. Less chaotic. Less contradictory. More intentional. And slowly, your mental environment begins to reorganize. Old fear-based scripts still appear, but they no longer feel automatic. They feel like echoes of a previous system running in the background. And because you are no longer fully identified with them, their emotional impact begins to weaken. Now, instead of reacting unconsciously, you begin to respond consciously. Instead of letting thoughts run freely, you begin to observe and redirect them. Instead of allowing emotional language to define you, you begin to choose your internal dialogue. And this is where transformation begins to stabilize. Because the subconscious mind does not resist clarity. It adapts to it. So you begin installing new internal language. Simple, direct, calm statements that reinforce a new inner direction. Statements like, I observe my mind instead of being controlled by it. I choose awareness over reaction. I am no longer defined by old mental patterns. And every time you repeat these internally, something subtle but real begins to shift. Not instantly, but gradually. Like a system updating in the background. Now your emotional responses begin to soften. Your reactions become slower. Your inner state becomes more stable. And even when old thoughts arise, they no longer feel like commands. They feel like signals. And you are no longer blindly following signals. You are interpreting them. And this interpretation is where freedom exists. Because once you can interpret your inner language instead of obeying it, you are no longer a prisoner of subconscious repetition. You are its programmer. And as this realization deepens, your inner world begins to feel more spacious. Less reactive. More aware. More intentional. You begin to notice a gap between thought and belief. Between feeling and identity. Between impulse and action. And in that gap, you rewrite. Not forcefully, but consciously. And the more you do this, the more your subconscious begins to adopt a new operating system. One built not on fear, but on awareness. Not on repetition of limitation, but on repetition of clarity. And slowly, your inner language transforms from chaotic reaction into conscious creation. Now, even in daily life, you practice this quietly. When you wake up, you set an internal tone instead of reacting to mental noise. When thoughts arise during the day, you observe their language before accepting it. When emotions appear, you translate them instead of becoming them. And this practice becomes your new foundation. Because you are no longer speaking randomly to your subconscious. You are speaking intentionally. And your subconscious is listening, always learning. And as this internal communication becomes clearer, you begin to sense something deeper forming beneath it all, as if even this rewritten language is now pointing toward a quieter space where no language is needed at all, just awareness itself watching everything unfold. Old emotional cycles begin to lose their repetition. The trigger no longer guarantees the same reaction. You interrupt the loop before it completes itself. This creates a new psychological space inside you. In this space, freedom quietly begins to grow. There is a moment in inner awareness where something subtle begins to shift, so subtle that you may not even notice it at first. A situation appears. A familiar trigger rises. A pattern begins to form. But this time, something unusual happens inside you. The loop does not complete itself. And in that interruption, everything begins to change. For most of your life, emotional patterns have followed a predictable structure. A word is spoken, a memory is activated. A situation unfolds, and an automatic emotional response takes over. Without pause. Without question. Without distance. It felt natural. It felt like you. But it was actually repetition. A loop built through years of emotional conditioning. And now, that loop is beginning to weaken. Not because life has changed, but because your awareness has entered the space before reaction. At first, this shift is barely noticeable. You still feel the beginning of the emotional surge. You still sense the familiar pressure building inside. The same thoughts try to form. The same feelings attempt to rise. The same internal narrative begins to repeat itself. But something new is present now. A gap. A pause. A moment where the automatic reaction does not fully take control. And in that moment, the loop breaks. You do not fall into it as quickly as before. You do not become it immediately. You see it forming, and you remain slightly outside of it. And this is where inner struggle begins. Because the emotional system inside you is built on speed. On instant reaction. On unconscious completion. It wants to finish the loop quickly because that is what it has always done. Trigger, reaction, emotion, identity, reinforcement. But now, something interrupts that sequence. And the interruption feels strange. Because part of you still wants to complete the familiar cycle. The cycle feels safe even when it creates suffering. It is predictable. Known. Rehearsed. But another part of you is no longer fully willing to participate. That part is observing. And observation changes everything. Because what is observed without identification begins to lose its automatic power. You start noticing something important. The trigger is still present, but the reaction is no longer guaranteed. And this breaks something fundamental inside your subconscious programming. Because your mind was built on expectation loops. Same trigger equals same reaction. But now, that equation is no longer stable. And the system begins to adjust. Slowly. Quietly. Almost invisibly. At first, emotional waves still rise. Old patterns still attempt to activate. Fear still tries to complete itself. Anger still tries to build momentum. Doubt still attempts to take control. But now, there is resistance in the form of awareness. Not resistance through suppression. But resistance through interruption. You are no longer fully inside the cycle. You are watching it begin. And sometimes, stopping it before it completes. And in this stopping, something powerful emerges. Space. A new kind of psychological space that did not exist before. A space between trigger and reaction. Between stimulus and identity. Between feeling and becoming. And in that space, freedom quietly begins to grow. But freedom at this stage does not feel dramatic. It feels subtle. Almost invisible. Like a soft silence inside the mind where urgency used to live. Now, instead of immediate reaction, there is awareness. Instead of automatic emotion, there is observation. Instead of unconscious repetition, there is conscious interruption. And this interruption is not random. It is training. You are training your nervous system to recognize that not every trigger requires completion. Not every thought requires belief. Not every emotion requires identity. And slowly, your subconscious begins to learn a new rule. Pause is possible. And in that pause, choice exists. At first, this feels unstable. Because your old emotional system relied on certainty. It needed predictable outcomes. It needed familiar reactions. It needed identity confirmation through repetition. But now repetition is breaking. And when repetition breaks, identity begins to soften. Because identity is built from repeated emotional responses. So when the responses change, identity cannot remain rigid. It begins to loosen. And as it loosens, something deeper begins to emerge. A witnessing presence that does not participate in every loop. A quiet awareness that simply sees without merging. And from this awareness, you begin to reprogram not by force, but by interruption. When an old emotional cycle begins, you do not resist it. You simply do not complete it. You notice the trigger. You feel the rise of emotion. You observe the beginning of the story forming in your mind. And then, you stop feeding it. And in that stopping, the cycle dissolves mid-formation. Not fully completed. not fully reinforced. And this weakens its future power. Because subconscious loops survive through completion. But when they are interrupted repeatedly, they begin to fade. Now your internal world starts to feel different. Less predictable. Less automatic. More spacious. And in this space, something begins to stabilize inside you. A new kind of emotional intelligence. One that does not react immediately. One that observes before responding. One that recognizes patterns before becoming them. And slowly, your relationship with your inner world transforms. You are no longer trapped inside emotional repetition. You are watching it from a slight distance. And sometimes, you choose differently. And each time you choose differently, a new pathway strengthens in your subconscious. Not through force, but through repetition of awareness. Now, even in daily life, this becomes your silent practice. When a familiar emotional trigger appears, you pause before responding. You feel the beginning of the cycle but do not rush into it. You allow space to form. You observe the pattern instead of completing it. And in that observation, the loop loses momentum. And what once controlled you instantly, now slows down. Becomes visible. Becomes interruptible. And eventually, becomes optional. This is where true transformation begins to stabilize. Not because emotions disappear. But because emotional cycles no longer control your timing. You are no longer reacting from inside the loop. You are standing just outside of it, watching it form, and sometimes choosing not to enter it at all. And in this simple shift, your energy begins to change completely. More calm. More centered. More conscious. And as this new space deepens inside you, you begin to sense something even more profound, as if behind every emotional loop there is a deeper source of awareness silently watching even the observer itself, waiting to be fully recognized. Beliefs once hidden in your subconscious now surface clearly. You see how they shaped your limitations and choices. Instead of resisting them, you begin rewriting them consciously. New beliefs are not forced, they are installed with awareness. Your inner reality starts restructuring itself. There is a moment in inner awareness when something once invisible begins to rise into view. Not as confusion. Not as chaos. But as clarity. You begin to notice that deep inside your mind, there are beliefs running quietly in the background of every thought, every reaction, every decision you make. And for the first time, you can see them. Not vaguely. But clearly. Like hidden instructions finally becoming readable. And what you are seeing now is not new. It was always there. But it was operating beneath awareness. Shaping your reactions without permission. Guiding your choices without permission. Defining your limits without permission. And now, you are finally witnessing the system. At first, this realization feels subtle. Almost like stepping into a deeper layer of your own mind where everything slows down just enough for you to observe the structure beneath your thoughts. You notice beliefs like quiet sentences running in the background. I am not enough. Things don't work out for me. I have to struggle. Change is difficult. And as you see them clearly for the first time, something inside you begins to shift. Because when beliefs were hidden, they controlled you. But when they are seen, they begin to lose unconscious authority. And this is where the inner struggle begins. Because part of you still reacts to these beliefs as if they are truth. They feel familiar. They feel repeated. They feel like identity. Even if they create limitation, they also create predictability. But another part of you is no longer fully accepting them. That part is observing. And in that observation, distance is created. And in that distance, transformation becomes possible. You begin to realize something profound. A belief is not a fact. It is a repeated mental instruction accepted over time. And anything that is learned can be unlearned. But not through force. Not through resistance. Through awareness. Now you start to notice how these beliefs shaped your entire inner architecture. How they influenced your emotional reactions before situations even happened. How they filtered your perception of opportunities, relationships, and possibilities. Nothing was random. Everything was filtered through belief. And now that filter is becoming visible. And once visible, it begins to loosen. But the mind does not immediately release old beliefs easily. Because beliefs are not just thoughts. They are emotional programs reinforced through repetition. So when a belief rises, it carries emotional weight. It feels real. It feels like truth. It feels like something you must obey. But now something different is happening. You are no longer merging with every belief automatically. You are watching them rise. And in that watching, something new begins to form. A gap between belief and identity. And in that gap, you regain power. Not forceful power, but conscious direction. Now, instead of resisting old beliefs, you begin to observe them with awareness. You do not fight them. You do not suppress them. You simply see them clearly. And in that clarity, they begin to lose their structure. Because beliefs only remain strong when they are unquestioned. And now you are questioning not with struggle, but with presence. You begin asking silently. Is this belief created from truth or repetition? Is this my present awareness or my past conditioning? And in these questions, something begins to shift inside you. Because the subconscious mind does not resist awareness. It responds to it. Now, instead of unconscious programming running freely, you begin introducing conscious direction. New beliefs are not forced into your system. They are gently installed through repeated awareness. And this is where reprogramming truly begins. You begin introducing new internal instructions. I observe my mind without being controlled by it. I am not limited by past conditioning. I am capable of change at every level of awareness. At first, these statements feel unfamiliar. Not because they are false, but because they are new patterns entering an old system. And the old system always resists change initially. But you continue anyway. Not with force, but with repetition. Calm repetition. Conscious repetition. And over time, something begins to happen. The old beliefs begin to lose emotional intensity. They still appear. But they no longer feel absolute. They begin to feel like echoes. Like outdated instructions running in the background of a system that is updating. And the new beliefs begin to strengthen. Not instantly, but steadily. Like water reshaping stone. Now your inner world starts to reorganize itself. Because belief determines perception. And perception determines emotional response. And emotional response determines behavior. So when belief changes, everything downstream begins to shift. You start noticing subtle differences. Situations that once triggered limitation now feel less fixed. Opportunities that once felt unreachable now feel slightly more open. Internal fear still appears, but it no longer defines your decisions instantly. There is a pause now. A space. A moment where old belief no longer automatically becomes action. And in that moment, you are free. This freedom is not loud. It is quiet. But it is real. Now, you begin practicing conscious belief rewriting in everyday life. When an old belief surfaces, you do not argue with it. You observe it. When limitation appears, you do not identify with it. You recognize it as old programming. When fear-based thinking arises, you do not obey it. You allow awareness to interrupt it. And in this interruption, new structure is formed. Because every time you choose awareness over automatic belief, you reinforce a new internal pathway. And slowly, your subconscious begins to adopt a new operating system. One where beliefs are not fixed truths, but flexible instructions. Now you are no longer trapped inside inherited mental patterns. You are actively participating in the design of your inner reality. And this changes everything. Because when belief becomes conscious, identity becomes fluid. And when identity becomes fluid, transformation becomes natural. You are no longer trying to become someone new. You are allowing outdated beliefs to dissolve while new awareness takes their place. And in this process, something powerful begins to stabilize inside you. A deeper sense of inner clarity. A quieter mental environment. A more conscious way of being. And as this clarity deepens, you begin to sense something even more profound beneath belief itself, as if there is a level of awareness that existed before any belief was formed, silently observing everything you are now beginning to rewrite. You no longer react to life, you design your inner response. Every thought becomes a deliberate construction. Your mind shifts from survival mode to creative mode. Inner authority replaces emotional dependence. You are now the architect, not the passenger. There is a point in inner evolution where something fundamental shifts in the way you experience life. You stop feeling like life is happening to you. And instead, you begin to notice something far more powerful. You are happening within life. And your inner response is no longer automatic. It becomes intentional. At first, this realization is subtle. Almost quiet. You still see external events unfolding as they always have. Situations still appear. People still speak. Circumstances still shift without warning. But something inside you no longer reacts in the same unconscious way. There is a pause now. A space. A moment before response. And in that moment, everything changes. Because for most of your life, your mind operated in survival mode. It reacted faster than awareness. It responded based on memory, emotion, and conditioning. Every external trigger created an internal reaction instantly. There was no design. Only reaction. But now, something new is emerging inside you. A conscious gap between stimulus and response. And in that gap, you begin to design. At first, this feels unfamiliar. Because the mind is not used to being observed while it reacts. It is used to moving automatically. It is used to following patterns without interruption. But now those patterns are slowing down. Not disappearing. But becoming visible. And what becomes visible, becomes editable. You start noticing how quickly your mind used to build emotional realities. A single thought would appear and instantly become a full inner world. Fear would construct worst-case scenarios. Doubt would construct limitation. Memory would construct emotional repetition. And you believed all of it. But now, you are no longer fully merging with those constructions. You are watching them form. And this is where the inner struggle begins. Because part of you still wants to react instantly. Still wants emotional certainty. Still wants familiar mental patterns that feel safe, even if they create limitation. But another part of you is no longer participating blindly. That part is observing. And in observation, control begins to shift. You begin to realize something profound. Your mind is not just reacting. It is constructing. Every thought is a building block. Every belief is a blueprint. Every repeated emotion is reinforcement of structure. And for the first time, you see the architecture of your inner world. Not as chaos, but as design. And this realization changes your entire relationship with thinking. Because if thoughts are construction materials, then you are not inside the construction. You are the one shaping it. And slowly, something begins to shift. You stop treating every thought as truth. You start treating thoughts as tools. You begin to see emotional reactions not as identity, but as signals from older designs still running in the background. And instead of being controlled by them, you begin to redesign them. This is where reprogramming becomes conscious. You no longer wait for life to shape your internal state. You begin shaping your internal state first. And life starts responding differently. At first, this feels like a subtle internal adjustment. A quiet shift in how you respond to stress, uncertainty, or emotional triggers. Instead of immediate reaction, there is observation. Instead of emotional collapse, there is awareness. Instead of unconscious behavior, there is intentional response. And in this shift, your identity begins to change. You are no longer the reactive self. You are becoming the designing self. The architect. The one who builds inner experience before it becomes outer expression. And this is not imagination. This is psychological restructuring. Because your inner state always precedes your outer reality. Now you begin to understand something deeper. If your mind is a system, then survival mode is just an old operating system running outdated programs. Programs built on fear, repetition, and unconscious conditioning. But awareness is the upgrade. And with awareness, you are no longer forced to run old programs. You can observe them, pause them, rewrite them, and replace them. So you begin practicing a new way of thinking. Instead of asking, "Why am I reacting like this?" you begin asking, "What is this reaction building inside me?" Instead of asking, "Why do I feel this fear?" you begin asking, "What instruction is this fear trying to repeat?" Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you begin asking, "What internal design is being activated right now?" And these questions change everything. Because they shift you from victim of experience to architect of experience. Now, even your thoughts begin to slow down. Not because you are forcing them, but because you are no longer feeding them unconscious energy. And in that slowing, space is created. A creative space. A conscious space. A designing space. And in this space, you begin to rebuild your inner world intentionally. You introduce new internal instructions. I choose awareness over reaction. I design my inner state before responding. I am no longer shaped by unconscious patterns. At first, these statements feel like guidance. But over time, they become structure. Your subconscious begins to accept them not as concepts, but as operating instructions. And slowly, your emotional responses begin to reorganize. Reactions that once felt automatic now feel optional. Thoughts that once felt overwhelming now feel manageable. Emotions that once controlled you now feel like data passing through a system you are learning to design. And in this shift, something stabilizes inside you. A sense of inner authority. Not forceful authority, but conscious authority. The kind that does not need to react to prove control. Because control is already present in awareness itself. Now you begin to notice this in daily life. When something unexpected happens, you pause before reacting. When an emotional trigger appears, you observe it before becoming it. When old thoughts arise, you recognize them as outdated structures rather than current truth. And in each moment of observation, you are redesigning your inner reality. Not through effort, but through awareness. And the more you practice this, the more your mind begins to shift from survival mode into creative mode. Because survival mode reacts to what is. But creative mode designs what can be. And now you are no longer trapped in reaction loops. You are stepping into conscious creation. Every thought becomes a choice. Every response becomes design. Every internal moment becomes architecture. And slowly, your entire sense of self begins to transform. You are no longer the passenger being carried by mental patterns. You are the architect shaping them. And as this realization deepens, something even more profound begins to emerge beneath it, as if even this act of designing your inner world is being observed by a deeper intelligence within you, silently aware of both the creator and the creation. There is no longer separation between awareness and identity. You live from a place of calm internal mastery. The shadow no longer leads, it integrates peacefully. Your subconscious and conscious mind move in alignment. This is not transformation anymore, it is embodiment. There is a moment in inner evolution where something quietly settles inside you. Not because everything is solved. Not because all thoughts disappear. Not because emotions stop rising. But because your relationship with all of it has fundamentally changed. You no longer stand outside yourself trying to control inner chaos. You are no longer divided between awareness and reaction. You are no longer switching between observer and participant. Something has unified. And in that unity, a deep internal silence begins to form. At first, you may not even recognize it as change. Because there is no dramatic shift. No emotional explosion. No sudden transformation. Instead, there is simply continuity. A steady awareness that remains present whether thoughts arise or not. Whether emotions move or not. Whether memories appear or dissolve. And this continuity becomes your new state of being. But the mind still tries, at times, to create separation. Old patterns still rise. Old shadows still attempt to reassert themselves. Old reactions still echo from memory. But now they no longer divide you. They move through you. Not as identity, but as experience. And in that subtle distinction, everything changes. You begin to notice that awareness and identity are no longer two separate forces fighting for control. They have merged. And what remains is a single unified field of conscious presence. At first, this feels unfamiliar. Because for so long, your life was built on internal division. A part of you reacting. A part of you observing. A part of you fearing. A part of you trying to control. But now those fragments begin to settle. Not by force, but by understanding. And slowly, integration happens. You are no longer trying to become aware. You are awareness expressing itself through experience. You are no longer trying to control the mind. You are the intelligence in which the mind naturally organizes itself. And in this realization, something deeply stabilizing occurs inside you. The urgency to fix yourself disappears. The need to fight thoughts fades. The compulsion to resist emotions dissolves. Because nothing inside you is seen as an enemy anymore. Everything is seen as movement. Everything is seen as expression. Everything is seen as part of a unified system becoming conscious of itself. And this is where embodiment begins. Not transformation as effort, but transformation as being. You begin to notice that your responses are no longer delayed by internal conflict. There is less hesitation between thought and action. Less distortion between feeling and awareness. Less fragmentation in your inner experience. Everything begins to move in alignment. Conscious mind and subconscious mind are no longer separate processes pulling in different directions. They begin to cooperate. Like two layers of the same intelligence finally recognizing each other. And in that recognition, internal resistance dissolves. Now when a thought arises, there is no struggle. When an emotion appears, there is no separation. When a memory surfaces, there is no identification or rejection. There is simply awareness, including everything without becoming trapped in anything. And this is what it means to live from internal mastery. Not control through force, but harmony through integration. You begin to notice the shift in daily life in subtle ways. Situations that once triggered internal conflict now pass through smoothly. Decisions that once created anxiety now feel natural. Emotional fluctuations still appear, but they no longer fracture your center. You remain intact. Not because life has become easier, but because your inner structure is no longer divided. Now, the shadow is no longer something you fight or suppress. It is something you see clearly, and therefore integrate. The unconscious patterns that once operated in darkness are now visible in awareness. And what is visible no longer controls you in the same unconscious way. Instead of resisting these patterns, you include them in awareness. Instead of rejecting them, you understand them. Instead of being controlled by them, you recognize their origin. And in that recognition, they soften. They lose urgency. They lose dominance. They become part of a larger whole rather than isolated forces acting against you. And slowly, you realize something profound. You were never fragmented. You only appeared fragmented when awareness was incomplete. Now awareness is continuous. And in continuity, there is unity. There is no longer higher self and lower self in conflict. There is only one field of consciousness expressing different layers of experience. And you are that field. Not as concept, but as lived reality. This is why nothing inside you feels foreign anymore. Even thoughts that once felt negative are now understood as temporary patterns. Even emotions that once felt overwhelming are now experienced as movement. Even past conditioning is now seen as history rather than identity. And this shift brings a deep calmness into your system. Not emotional excitement, but stable presence. A stillness that does not depend on external conditions. A clarity that does not fluctuate with internal movement. A grounded awareness that remains even when everything else changes. Now, your practice is no longer about becoming different. It is about remaining aware. Not adding. Not removing. But simply being conscious in all states. And in this simplicity, mastery is born. Because mastery is not complexity. It is integration. It is the absence of internal conflict. It is the alignment of all layers of mind into one coherent awareness. And as this alignment deepens, something subtle yet powerful becomes clear. You are no longer practicing awareness. You are living as awareness. Not occasionally. Not selectively. But continuously. And from this continuity, life itself feels different. Less fragmented. Less reactive. More fluid. More conscious. And as you rest in this embodied awareness, you begin to sense something even deeper beneath it all, as if even this unified state is held within a stiller dimension of presence that does not shift, does not react, and does not change, and you begin to feel that what you are is not only awareness in life, but the silence in which even awareness dissolves.